Hi students, and welcome back to another section of our study of environmental science. Today we'll be talking about evolution and diversity, part 2, tolerance limits. So we'll learn about tolerance limits and how they affect evolution, and we'll also be learning about the development of species through a process called speciation. So an organism's physiology and behavior allow it to survive only in certain environments. Temperature, moisture level, nutrient supply, soil and water chemistry, living space, and other environmental factors must be at appropriate levels for organisms to persist. Generally, some critical limiting factor keeps an organism from expanding everywhere. Limitations can include number one, physiological stress due to inappropriate levels of some critical environmental factor like water, light, temperature, pH. Or number two, could be resulting from competition with other species. Or three, predation, including parasitism and disease. So any one of these could constrain a species in different circumstances. Ecologist Victor Shelford developed a principle of tolerance limits by stating that each environmental factor has both minimum and maximum levels, beyond which a particular species cannot survive or is unable to reproduce. The single factor closest to these survival limits, Shelford postulated, is the critical factor that limits where a particular organism can live. Tolerance limits affect species distribution. For every environmental factor, there is an optimal range within which a species lives or reproduces most easily, so abundance is high. The horizontal axis here could represent a factor such as temperature, rainfall, vegetation height, or availability of some critical resource. Habitat describes the place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. The term ecological niche is more functional, describing both the role played by a species in a biological community and the set of environmental factors that determine its distribution. The concept of niche was first defined in 1927 by the British ecologist Charles Elton. To Elton, each species had a role in a community of species, and the niche defined its way of obtaining food, the relationships it had with other species, and the services it provided to the community. Some species tolerate a wide range of conditions or exploit a wide range of resources. These species are known as generalists. Generalists often have large geographic ranges, as is the case of the black bear, which is omnivorous, abundant, and ranges across most of North America's forested regions. Sometimes, generalists are also weedy species or pests, such as rats, cockroaches, or dandelions, because they thrive in a broad variety of environments. Other species, such as the giant panda, are specialists, and they have a narrow ecological niche. Pandas have evolved from carnivorous ancestors to subsist almost entirely on bamboo, a large but low-nutrient grass. To acquire enough nutrients, pandas must spend as much as 16 hours a day eating. The panda's slow metabolism, slow movements, and low reproductive rate help it survive on this highly specialized diet. Its narrow niche now endangers the giant panda, as recent destruction of most of its native bamboo forest has reduced its range and its population to the margin of survival. As explained by Russian biologist G.F. Gauss, complete competitors cannot coexist. The general term for this idea is the principle of competitive exclusion. That is, no two species can occupy the same ecological niche for long. The species that is most efficient in using available resources will exclude the other. The other species disappears or develops a new niche, exploiting resources differently, a process known as resource partitioning. Partitioning can allow several species to utilize different parts of the same resource and coexist within a single habitat. A classic example of resource partitioning is that of woodland warblers, studied by ecologist Robert MacArthur. Although several similar warbler species foraged in the same trees, they avoided competition by specializing in different levels of the forest canopy or in inner and outer branches. Several species of insect-eating wood warblers occupy the same forests in eastern North America. The competitive exclusion principle predicts that the warblers should partition the resource, that is, insect food, in order to reduce competition, and in fact, the warblers feed in different parts of the forest. The giant saguaro cactus, which grows in the dry, hot Sonoran Desert of southern Arizona and northern Mexico, for example, is tolerant of extreme heat and drought, intense sunlight, and nutrient-poor soils, but it is extremely sensitive to freezing temperatures. A single winter night with temperatures below freezing for 12 or more hours kills growing tips on the branches, preventing further development. Because of this sensitivity, the northern edge of the saguaro's range corresponds to a zone where freezing temperatures are less than half a day at any time. As a population becomes more adapted to its ecological niche, it may develop specialized or distinctive traits that eventually differentiate it entirely from its biological cousins. The development of new species is called speciation. In the Galapagos finches, speciation occurred largely because of geographic isolation. The islands are far enough apart that in many cases populations were genetically isolated. They couldn't interbreed with populations on other islands. These isolated populations gradually changed in response to their individual environments, some of which were extremely dry, with sparse vegetation, while others were relatively moist with greater abundance and diversity of food resources. Speciation that occurs when populations are geographically separated is known as allopatric speciation. The barriers that divide subpopulations aren't always physical. For example, two virtually identical tree frogs live in similar habitats of eastern North America, but have different mating calls. This difference, which is enough to prevent interbreeding, is known as behavioral isolation. Speciation that occurs within one geographic area is known as sympatric speciation. Fern species and other plants sometimes undergo sympatric speciation by doubling or quadrupling the chromosome number of their ancestors, which makes them reproductively incompatible. Geographic isolation can lead to allopatric, or geographically separated, speciation. For example, in cool, moist glacial periods, Arizona was forested, and red squirrels interbred freely, as in the figure on the top. As the climate warmed and dried, desert replaced forests on the plains. Therefore isolated in remnant forests on mountains, populations became reproductively isolated and began to develop different traits, as shown in the bottom figure. Sometimes environmental conditions can reduce variation in a trait. This would be a stabilizing selection, or they can cause traits to diverge to the extremes, which is called disruptive selection. Competition can cause disruptive selection, which allows for better partitioning of a resource. Directional selection can be observed in the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and of pesticide-tolerant insects. In both cases, individuals that happen to have better than average tolerance of these compounds tend to survive in a population, while other individuals die off. Resistant survivors produce new generations, leading to a population with the resistant traits. A trait such as beak shape can change as changing environmental conditions make one type more advantageous for survival. From an original population with wide variation in the trait, as shown in the figure A, environmental conditions might favor one extreme, for instance, figure B, or neither extreme, which would be figure C. Where a population occupies contrasting conditions, traits in the different areas may diverge, as shown in figure D, producing two distinct populations. Now that we've learned about how species can change and evolve over time, let's go on to part 3 of this lecture and take a look at how species are named. We call this taxonomy.